Possible ceasefire in Gaza. I think there's been a bit of an update on that. Is a new round going to start?
Well, we're told, yes, in the coming days, and this is according to the Israeli Prime Minister's office, there will be a new round taking place in Cairo and in Doha. Of course, those both capitals of countries acting as mediators here. This is after Hamas said earlier in the week that it was not accepting compromises that had been set out by mediators and the US. Now, this high-level delegation going back, apparently the Israeli Prime Minister speaking with the spy chief, the head of the Mossad, telling them they will have room to operate in upcoming negotiations.
Europe has entered a pre-war era. If Ukraine is defeated by Russia, nobody in Europe will be able to feel safe. His remarks came as a fresh barrage of Russian missiles targeted Ukraine's energy infrastructure. A number of people were injured and power was cut in several central and western regions of the country. Professor Paul Moorcroft is a former senior instructor at the Royal Military Academy in the UK. He's also the author of the book Putin's Wars and NATO's Flaws: Why Russia Invaded Ukraine.
I tend to agree with him. I think we're in the most dangerous period in modern history since 1945, worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis, because we've been ignoring the need to build up defence. In the last budget in Britain, there was no mention of defence, and the Tories are supposed to be the party of defence, and we hear nothing from the Labour leader. We are not building up British defence, and Tusk, as the former European Council and recent Polish Prime Minister, he's pushed his defence spending to 4% of GDP. We're at 2, supposedly going to 2.5. But we need to concentrate. Our forces are very weak. We could not fight. We're talking about pre-war. Should the Russians should we get involved with a shooting war? The British they don't have ammunition, as the military have been saying. We cannot fight the Russians at the moment. We are too weak. And we certainly can't do it without the Americans. And that depends on NATO still involving the Americans. And if Donald Trump wins, the situation is very dangerous. But on the other hand, we shouldn't provoke the Russians, I think, in the way that the French has.
Donald Tusk said that Europe should be more militarily self-sufficient, but how achievable is that at a time of economic challenges across Europe?
Well, the prime imperative of any government is defence of the realm. That's not happening in Britain. The British armed forces have been run down, and other armies too. And the Germans, although they've changed their philosophy, they're still very weak. We cannot fight the Russians without the Americans. Now, should we fight the Russians? Now, the thing is, I don't believe. I understand why the Poles and Donald Tusk, I understand. He talks about his experiences. He grew up just on the eve of the Second World War. The Poles are very exposed, so the Baltic states. I don't think that Putin is mad. Now, I think he's quite cautious. But he will take advantage if he can, and it's quite clear that he's on a roll, and there will be a counter-offensive, and the Ukrainians probably, and sadly, despite their bravery, will be pushed back. Biden is not going to do anything, and Trump may not either, and the Brits are laughably weak. As I say, the French are saying they're going to send NATO troops to Ukraine. Now, that is more than baiting the bear. It's getting into the bear cage and closing the door behind you. The French, from being very friendly towards Putin, have suddenly decided, what they say, the bâton-guerre had become very gung-ho. Situation is dangerous. We shouldn't provoke the Russians. On the other hand, we need to build up our armed forces. We need to build up our defense. And sadly, that means we can't focus so much on the NHS or education. But nobody's going to say that in the election, are they?
That's Professor Paul Moorcroft talking to the BBC. Just to remind you of those comments made by President Volodymyr Zelensky in an interview published on Friday in the Washington Post, saying that if it doesn't get the promised US military aid, it's being blocked by Congress currently, its forces will have to retreat in small steps, he said. It means we will go back, he goes on, retreat step by step in small steps. We are trying to find some way not to retreat. That interview coming out in the last few hours in the Washington Post. You're listening to ABC News Radio. Let me bring it back home because we'll turn to finance. And if you were watching the local markets, you would have seen that they ended the shortened trading week up by over 1%. Kind of echoed record gains in the United States, especially on the S&P. Independent analyst Evan Lucas from InvestSmart explains what he thinks is behind the record run.
Let's go back to when it really started. It was October last year. So if you look at the very end of October and that bottom sort of period on the 31st here in Australia, the 30th over in the States, was off the idea that we were unsure about what was going to happen with interest rates. And since then, it's been on a tear because we saw over in the US Federal Reserve confirm their view that they were going to start cutting rates in 2024. And that hasn't really slowed down. There's been has ticked up, so February is a great example. But once we saw last week that Jay Powell confirmed that it will happen this year, it will be multiple, not as much as they originally forecasted, which was 4, 3. All of that confirmed it and it's continued to run. It's also, again, the other part of the answer is AI, and the AI revolution is the big driver inside the US. I mean, if you look at Apple, for example, although it's declined this year, at one point it was 7% of the S&P 500. That difference has now been made up by an Nvidia. It's also been made up by Microsoft, which is now the largest company on the planet. So those two together explains why the S&P is soaring to record highs, and why at the moment people don't think it's going to slow down. There are suggestions the AI market over the next 5 years could be $100 billion in size alone, and going to almost, inverted commas, the moon in some people's view over the next 2 decades.
Well, there was a big listing on the New York Stock Exchange this week. Donald Trump's Truth Social hit the boards. I mean, do you think this loss-making venture is worth the $9 billion it's valued at? And I mean, do we have any idea how this will impact Donald Trump's electoral prospects?
If you look at its first day listing, at one point it was up over 56%, then fell to only close up 16%. Next day had another, incredible movement. And then it goes down. It's fascinating. This is the first time in 30 years that Donald Trump has listed something inside his business empire. He normally doesn't do it. And that, I think, also is part of the answer in the fact that he is trying to get value where he can, because he isn't making money out of it. It isn't actually getting revenue like a Meta does with advertisement. It's not doing the same thing that a Google or an Apple does with technology and software. It's just a platform, and there is no revenue really coming for it. So where it goes is a great question. What it does to his presidency, I mean, again, if you're on Truth Social following Donald Trump, it's more likely than not you're a follower of him. So again, if it goes backwards, could the argument be made that obviously his followers are turning him off? Maybe. I actually think it's more about the business prospect of it. Nobody is advertising on it yet to make it profitable.
And briefly, inflation data was out this week. Was it Swiftonomics or not?
There was a bit there. I mean, if you look at the inflation data, everybody got a little bit sort of excited by the fact that hotels and restaurants jumped up. But if you jumped into the state data showed that New South Wales and Victoria were the only ones that benefited from that. And considering that she was only in Sydney and Melbourne for the month of February, that would probably explain that away. She moved the dial, not as much as some were forecasting, but it was there. Overall, though, the inflation data is absolutely on trend with the RBA's forecast. The narrow path is still very much there. It looks like on the numbers that you're getting that it will be the end of this year, we hit the top of their target band, the 2 to 3%, and mid-2025 to the end of 2026, it'll be in the middle of that. So we are on track, and therefore we are on track with their assumptions. And their assumptions are that they will start cutting rates possibly twice this year, not next year.
Evan Lucas talking to us earlier. Armaguard has rejected a $26 million lifeline offered by some of Australia's biggest companies to keep the cash transport company afloat. Earlier this week, the company, which is controlled by the trucking magnate Lindsay Fox, was given a deadline to either accept or reject a financial lifeline to avert insolvency and to keep the cash flowing to major businesses. Major banks, supermarkets, Australia Post and the retailer Wesfarmers had proposed the $26 million rescue package to prevent its possible collapse, but Armaguard's refused to open its books, and that was one of the conditions of the proposed package, and rejected the lifeline on Thursday, confirming it would instead work on its own financial solution. Samantha Donovan has more details.
The white armoured trucks of Armaguard are responsible for transporting about 90% of the cash used by Australians around the country. But the businesses it serves have been worried it was headed for insolvency and cash supplies could dry up. So a $26 million deal was offered to Armaguard to keep it afloat. Swinburne University professor Steve Worthington.
Well, it was a deal put together by the Australian Banking Association, working with, on behalf, if you like, of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and working with some retailers such as supermarket chains and Australia Post. And the bid was to ensure that Armaguard stayed in business, both the delivery of cash to banks and ATMs and etc., and the collection of cash from retailers. So that was a deal to hopefully make sure that they stayed in business.
The former secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Bill Kelty, represented Armaguard at a meeting chaired by the Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Bullock. She stressed the need for the company's future to be sorted out. Professor Steve Worthington researches payment systems and consumer behaviour. He says the rejection of the offer isn't necessarily a surprise.
Well, yes and no. I was surprised because I thought it was quite a good deal for them, really. But no, in the sense that I think this is a bit like a property auction where someone's made the first bid, but the property is going to say we're not on the available for the market yet. So it's a first bid in what could be an ongoing and who knows how long it will last. No, I think Armaguard is trying to raise the amount of money that they'll get for their continued provision of a service.
Another company in declining this offer has said it continues to operate its full suite of services and it's confident it'll get onto a long-term sustainable footing over the coming months. How likely do you think that is?
Well, I think that is likely. They're going to carry on doing what they do, and hopefully, I'm sure they're hoping to get more backing from the various involved parties who are saying are organised by the Australian Banking Association. But they need to bear in mind here that the Reserve Bank has said quite clearly that they want cash to remain as a means of payment. And they'll be pushing and trying to cajole people to actually come to a settlement that guarantees that the provision cash in transit for the next, I'd say, 2 or 3 years at least.
The supermarket giant Coles had been so concerned Armaguard would collapse, it stopped scheduled services for the delivery of banknotes and coins until April the 5th, but said customers would still be able to use cash in that period. But Coles confirmed it has restarted its cash deliveries from Armaguard. The National Secretary of the Transport Workers Union, Michael Caine, is worried about Armaguard's prospects.
This is potentially catastrophic for everyone in the community, ultimately. We've got banks that have been squeezing this industry for years, and now that Armaguard is the only game left in town, the banks have a responsibility to step up and ensure that it's properly funded so that Australians can continue to get their cash.
So you're saying the banks don't pay Armaguard enough for their services?
They certainly don't. Our understanding is that there's a $51 million a year shortfall. That's $1 million a week that Armaguard is having to make up at the moment. This is a fixed cost. There are armoured trucks, expert workers who are highly trained in a very dangerous profession. People have died doing this work. There are fixed costs that must be met, and there's only so much you can squeeze before the entity becomes unviable. That's almost the territory that Armaguard's in, and the banks have an obligation, and the Reserve Bank has an obligation in its charter too, to push the banks to make sure that this remaining operator, this gold standard operator, is able to operate in a viable way.
The union says 1,500 delivery drivers work for Armaguard across Australia.
Now to some potentially good news for people at risk of developing breast cancer. New research by Cambridge University in the UK suggests that drugs normally used to treat advanced tumours could also be used to treat healthy people who carry breast cancer-causing gene mutations. Dr. Liz O'Riordan is a retired breast cancer surgeon who's had the disease herself 3 times.
It's fantastic. The incredible research that's happened in the last couple of years to find ways of personally targeting breast cancer is just incredible.
Tell us a bit about these gene mutations, first of all. Just remind us, it's BRCA1 and BRCA2 is what they're known as, isn't it?
That's right. So they're the genes that Angelina Jolie had. And if you have one of these genes, it means that you have a lifetime risk of developing breast cancer that's 70%. compared to a normal woman with no family history whose risk is 15%. And at the moment, we offer women bilateral mastectomies to reduce the risk that they develop breast cancer in the future.
So how would these drugs, what are they, how would they work then to treat people who carry those gene mutations?
So what the researchers did was analyse breast tissue from 55 women, and they discovered that immune cells in the breast of women who carry these mutations were exhausted. They weren't working properly, and we use our immune system to detect and kill cancer cells. Now, when you have advanced stage breast cancer that's spread, we use immunotherapy to try and give the immune system a boost to stop the cancer growing. And it could be that these immunotherapy drugs could be offered to healthy women with a mutation to avoid them needing bilateral mastectomies in the future.
And those exhausted immune cells, if you like, I mean, how surprising is that there's the presence of those cells in healthy women?
I think it was a huge shock, nothing that we'd expected at all, but it's opened up the grounds for more research to see what other cells might be affected in women who have a high risk of developing breast cancer, so we can give them more targets. We don't know why it happens at the moment, and they are testing the drug in mouse models because we have to check the drug is safe. There are side effects, so would healthy women want to take it, but it's really exciting.
And crucially, as you mentioned, raises the possibility that preventative surgery, mastectomy, could be avoided.
Yeah, it's a huge decision that many women in their 20s and 30s are making because their risk of getting breast cancer is high for life. And it could be that a couple of years of an immunotherapy drug may avoid that surgery, and that would be fantastic.
It certainly would. You're listening to ABC News Radio with me, Chris Mitchell. Time to check in with Fraser Fife and get the latest sport.
Thanks, Chris. Well, Brisbane has ended North Queensland's unbeaten start to the NRL season, 38 points to 12 in their Good Friday derby at Lang Park. The Broncos led 20-12 at half-time and then kept the Cowboys scoreless for the rest of the game. Brisbane captain Adam Reynolds and teammate Patrick Carrigan were the stars as the Broncos recorded their second win of the season. Reynolds has told ABC Sport that the Cowboys were a difficult opponent.
Playing some great football, the Cowboys. To hold them to 12 points is a fair effort. We're still not quite exactly where we want to be, but it's certainly a step in the right direction.
In Friday's other match, the Rabbitohs beat the Bulldogs 20 points to 16. In Super Rugby Pacific, the Melbourne Rebels have beaten the New South Wales Waratahs 27-21 in Sydney. The Crusaders had an upset 37-26 win over the Chiefs in Christchurch. And in the women's competition, the Waratahs defeated the Rebels 38-17. Meanwhile, the Brumbies will take on Queensland at Lang Park tonight in a battle of the top two Australian sides in Super Rugby Pacific. Last year's 52-24 win over the Reds broke a streak of 6 consecutive losses in Brisbane for the ACT side. Brumbies coach Stephen Larkham says it's not an easy place to win.
They've been traditionally a good team in the competition. We've obviously got the travel stuff, we've got potential humidity, really good crowd up there normally as well, so there's lots of factors that go into the tight games that we have with them.
Carlton has now got 3 wins from 3 matches to start the AFL season after beating North Melbourne by 56 points at Docklands. The Blues won 21 goals 11-137 to the Kangaroos 12-9-81. Harry Mackay kicked 5 goals for Carlton and teammate Charlie Curnow contributed 4. Harry Sheasel had 32 disposals for the Kangaroos. Carlton midfielder Adam Chera has told ABC Sport it was a solid performance.
Yeah, we're really happy. We want to be known for a consistent home and away team. Tonight's a stepping stone. The more games we play, the stronger it's going to get. So I was really pleased with the boys tonight.
Meanwhile, the Carlton Football Club says it is standing in solidarity with former player Eddie Betts after racial slurs were hurled at children playing basketball at his house. Natalie Whiting has more.
The Carlton Football Club has praised Eddie Betts and his family for their bravery in releasing a video showing a car driving past their home and shouting racial obscenities at a group of children playing basketball in the yard. The club has said absolutely nobody, especially children, should ever be subjected to what was heard in that video. It's praised Betts for calling out the behaviour and offering to educate the person and said everyone needs to follow his example. Victoria Police is now investigating and has asked anyone with information to contact Crime Stoppers.
The Kolkata Knight Riders have defeated Royal Challengers Bengaluru by 7 wickets in cricket's Indian Premier League. Australian Cameron Green scored 33 and countryman Glenn Maxwell 28 as RCB posted 6 for 182 in their 20 overs. A half-century from Venkatesh Iyer helped Kolkata to reach the total with around 3 overs to spare. The win sees the Knight Riders move up to second on the points table with victories in their opening 2 games. And Italian tennis player Jannik Sinner is through to the final of the ATP Tour's Miami Open after defeating Daniil Medvedev in straight sets. The 22-year-old secured the result in just over an hour, winning 6-1, 6-2. A victory in the final would secure Sinner his 3rd title of the season and move him up to 2nd in the rankings. He'll face off against either Grigor Dimitrov or Alexander Zverev in the decider. And the other semi-final is underway in the opening set, tied at 2 games apiece, so still no real indication as to who Sinner will face off in the final. Chris?
Thanks very much, Fraser. Speak to you again in around about half an hour. You're listening to ABC News Radio with me, Chris Mitchell. Quick check on the weather and then the news headlines for you. If you're in Brisbane today, 28 and partly cloudy. Sydney this Saturday, 27 and sunny. Canberra, 30 degrees your top and mostly sunny this afternoon. Melbourne becoming sunny, a top of 24 for you there. Hobart today, calm, little to no wind, possible light shower later, 21 degrees. If you're in Adelaide today, 31 and sunny. Perth, 29 and partly cloudy, and Darwin today, showers and a possible storm for you, a top of 33 degrees. Coming up to 10:30 Eastern Daylight Time, making it 7:30 in the west. News headlines are next. Good morning.
ABC News with Sally Ann Young. A new round of Gaza ceasefire talks are due to begin in the coming days after Israel agreed to send negotiators to Egypt and Qatar. Correspondent Lauren Day reports from Jerusalem.
The United States, Qatar and Egypt have spent weeks trying to negotiate a ceasefire and hostage release deal. But earlier this week, Israel withdrew its negotiators, saying the truce talks had reached a dead end. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has now confirmed the country will return to the table and send delegations to both Cairo and Doha. Despite a binding United Nations resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, fighting has continued throughout the week, including around hospitals. Lauren Day, ABC News, Jerusalem.
The White House has vowed to bring home an American journalist who has now spent 1 year in a Russian jail, described by the US as unfair detention. Europe correspondent Isabella Higgins reports.
Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was arrested while on an assignment on March 29 last year. He's now spent 1 year in a Russian prison. He's the first American journalist to be charged with espionage in the country since the Cold War. Moscow has still presented no evidence of the charges, with the 32-year-old, his publisher and the White House all rejecting these accusations. US President Joe Biden says America is working to bring him home. White House officials claim the American is being used as a bargaining chip for future prisoner swaps. His publisher printed an empty front page with the words, "His story should be here."
A presenter for a London-based Iranian television channel has been repeatedly stabbed outside his home. The BBC's Khazra Naji reports.
The attack happened as Puriya Zeraati, who's one of the top presenters of Iran International Television, was leaving home. A group of men attacked him with knives. One source close to Iran International said it did not seem that the aim of the attack was to kill him, as the injuries are not life-threatening. Iran International is a Persian-language opposition channel popular in Iran and staunchly critical of the Iranian authorities. So the suspicion falls on the agents of Iran or men belonging to criminal gangs hired by Iran, an attempt to silence Iranian journalists in London.
The Northern Territory Police Commissioner is questioning whether an extension of the snap 2-week youth curfew in Alice Springs will be possible after the idea was floated by the Chief Minister. Miles Holbrook-Walk reports.
Police are saying they're going to assess each night the effectiveness. Now, at the moment, they're saying the curfew is working and it's doing its job thus far, that they're engaging with young people in a way that is effective, that's, they say, preventing crime, and that around the kind of 8 to 10 day mark, they haven't given a specific date, they'll make another assessment around what is the data telling them about how they're engaging with young people and whether or not they can indeed extend it out further. At one point, the Police Commissioner, Michael Murphy, has raised is this idea that when you move 60 police from other parts of the Northern Territory down to Alice Springs, what that does is it creates gaps elsewhere, and those gaps can't exist forever.
The non-profit organisation Wayside Chapel is encouraging young people to spend 60 minutes a day having face-to-face social interactions. It launched the campaign on TikTok this week after a landmark report found 1 in 3 Australians feel lonely and disconnected. This is particularly among those aged between 18 and 24. Pastor and CEO of Wayside Chapel, John Owen, says there are many ways people can stay connected, especially over the Easter long weekend.
It can be your first contact with which is your 1 or 2 minutes with your barista. I think cafes have become really important because in the working from home era, it might be the only social interaction you have for the day. Through to the more substantive, have meals, shared meals together at the dinner table, put the phone away.
The Vatican says Pope Francis has skipped the traditional Good Friday procession at Rome's Colosseum to preserve his health over Easter. It's the first time he skipped the event in his 11-year papacy. The 87-year-old has recently been suffering respiratory issues and has asked an aide to read aloud his speeches, even skipping his Palm Sunday homily or service on Saturday and then celebrate Easter Mass on Sunday. You're up to date with the latest ABC News. For more news at any time, you can download the ABC Listen app or head to the ABC Listen website.
You're listening to ABC News Radio.
With me, Chris Mitchell, coming up this half hour, world leaders ramp up their criticism of Moscow over the treatment of imprisoned American journalist Evan Gershkovich. We'll also hear from the former US ambassador to NATO. He's warning the US administration to be careful about how it secures Gershkovich's freedom. And the American actor Lou Gossett Jr., the first black man to win the Best Supporting Actor Academy Award, has died at the age of 87. First, though, to a political scandal in Northern Ireland, where Sir Geoffrey Donaldson has been charged with rape and other historical sexual offences and has resigned as Democratic Unionist Party leader. The 57-year-old woman has also been charged with aiding and abetting in connection with the alleged offences. They were both arrested by detectives and were questioned before being charged. Gavin Robinson has been named as interim DUP leader.
Been a devastating revelation and has caused tremendous shock, not just for myself personally or my colleagues within the DUP, but for the community right across Northern Ireland. It came as a great shock. But we are a party and individuals that believe in justice. We have faith in our criminal justice system. And so in the coming days and months, I think it is important that none of us say anything or act in any way that would seek to prejudice what is now an ongoing criminal investigation.
When did the party become aware of the allegations, and what has been the response of the party to them?
Very late last night, the party became aware whenever it was revealed publicly that there had been an individual and another charged, and it became clear to us who that individual was. In the early hours of this morning, we took steps to make sure we could bring colleagues together, discuss what it was we had learned, and take the appropriate steps that we could. As you know, Geoffrey Donaldson has stepped down as party leader. He has indicated that to us, but through our disciplinary process, we similarly had to take the steps to suspend him from party membership until the conclusion of what is now a live criminal investigation. And in discussing that with colleagues, it was put to
House
me,
lights up. Let's see the
that there
people's
was
champion. Let's get some
unanimity
house lights up in here.
across colleagues that I should step forward and act